Hello everyone and welcome back to Nostalgia Poisoning. Today I'm going to be doing a little bit of a foundational video that talks about a lot of the principles that I'm going to be using in this channel. So this is really just an idea of what my thought process is as I go through a lot of these games that are sequels, prequels, and the original game, and a lot of the legacy games that came after them that serve as spiritual successors to those games. I will be talking about these principles pretty often. I will talk about why they're important, and I'm going to basically define my terms because otherwise I am sure somebody will misinterpret it, get annoyed, and leave angry comments down below. Generally speaking, by all means, leave angry comments down below. It's always good to have feedback, even when it's negative. But with that, let's get started. Sequels and prequels are a staple in the video game world, as I'm sure we're all aware. We regularly see sequels and prequels popping up all over the place for every genre imaginable. It's nothing particularly new. And it's not necessarily a good or a bad thing. There have been very, very good prequels and very, very good sequels out there. Rarely the prequels and the sequels can actually surpass the greatness and the genuine glory of their originals, but sometimes they do accomplish some truly incredible things. Now, when sequels and prequels are made, they are very rarely made by design. Some games are made with the intent of being things like a trilogy, but generally speaking, they are only made when a game has demonstrated a certain level of popularity and profitability. Very few sequels or prequels exist that are labors of love that are done solely by the developer to continue telling their story and to not earn money. And that's simply how the market works. And generally speaking, it's better for the market to work this way because that way these developers will know what their fans like. Or at least until recently when they stopped paying attention to their fans and then they started losing a lot of money. Now, games that have sequels are, by design, generally have better sequels or prequels than those that are kind of made on a whim, but that's not a universal. There have been planned sequels that have been very, very bad, and planned prequels are almost always bad. So let's move on to talk about our definitions. What is a prequel? What is a sequel? This may seem obvious, but let's just get this over with. A prequel is a game made after the original, designed to tell a story that happened before the original game, usually to provide better foundation and answer some questions that weren't answered in the original game. This is not always a good thing. Answering all the questions is actually, generally speaking, not necessarily the kind of thing you want to do. If you remove all of the mystery of the genre, you actually remove interest. So you have to have a good balance of what you're going to explain and what you're never going to explain. So long as you don't explain everything, people will still keep coming back. Now, a sequel is a game after the original as a continuation of a plot or to tell a new story based in the same world, taking place after the events of the first game, usually as a consequence of the final moments of the prior game. Now, obviously, this requires a great deal of literary skill in both parts in order for this to be a good game. It very regularly is not. And why is that? Why do sequels generally suck so bad? And the answer is one, the writers usually have very high expectations from both their company and the fans, and the demand is also very high, especially if the game is particularly popular. A great example, as displayed here, is Mega Man X, which was a very much a spiritual successor and actually a sequel to the Mega Man series that takes place as a consequence of the actions in the Mega Man series, and the writing of that particular series went very well for a time, but there's no guarantee that the original story writer who made the world will be part of a new project, even if it's a successful franchise. The creator can move on to do other things. Someone else has to take up the torch, and that is not particularly easy. Again, Mega Man is a great example. The original producer of Mega Man, the guy who's responsible for the entire story, both old Mega Man and Mega Man X, that poor guy left Capcom, and Capcom was basically, you know, left with this very popular franchise with a lot of expectations from the fans and a lot of bad blood. And as a result, the Mega Man series heavily suffered and has actually stagnated pretty bad. They did bring in somebody else to make a series of new games, and he did a very good job. Mega Man 11 was a commercial success, but even he has recently left Capcom. So it can leave a entire setting in limbo for years. Many games also are not designed to have more than one game in their series in case it is a commercial failure. Investing in new game development is very expensive. The video game industry is bigger than the movie industry. It surpassed it years ago, and it is a massive monster compared to the actually now relatively tiny movie industry. It's actually kind of embarrassing for Hollywood and serves them right. So, why do they sometimes thrive? Why are they successful? Principally, it's good story writing. The good story writing the good writing of a good author can drag people in and make a boring game amazing. They can make a average game great. They can actually make you stick with the suffering agony of a poorly designed game just so you know what happens to the people that you've invested so much time in learning about. Also, proper use of innovation can expand the world, make the world seem deeper and bigger and more interesting, and also provides leads into other games within the same universe. So a well-made game with good innovation can actually provide many stories within the same world. Now, a refinement of the original game mechanics can provide a better game experience and give the world a feeling of growth. You're able to do new things because the world itself has progressed. Now, this is a bit of a two-edged sword because prequels, they're not actually meant to have progression beyond the original game. You have to actually bring things from a prior state to the original standard in order for it to make any sense. Otherwise, people start sitting there, sit there and go, "Why didn't they have this in the present? Why am I having all this cool shit in the past?" And it makes very complicated story writing, which can have a lot of holes in it. Now, the core elements of sequels and prequels are innovation, legacy, and continuity for sequels. And for prequels, it's retcons, foundation, and progression. For a good sequel to really shine, it needs those three elements. A prequel, however, is much harder. It needs all three of the prior ones, and it requires to deal with retcons, build a foundation, and show progression. Now, what do I mean by this crap? Okay, innovation. How do you make the gameplay better from the first? How do you make it so the player feels like they're actually playing a new game while still being in the same world? That's not easy because you have to keep it within the same framework, but also give them something new to do, or at the very least, make what they were doing more intuitive. And that's not easy. What new mechanics does the sequel bring? This is a example of one of the greatest pitfalls of a lot of sequels because they try desperately to add new mechanics and they try it so hard that they have a tendency of bloating the game with crap that doesn't matter. And how do these new mechanics and these new gameplay elements work within the framework of the story? How does the end of the prior game bring forth these new mechanics within the world of its sequel? And that's also a hard story to tell. And because if you don't do this, all of your enhancements feel like they're tacked on for the sake of padding the game and expanding the time people need to play. A great example that I make of this is not actually in Secret of Mana, but it's in a related game. It's the difference between Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy VII. In Final Fantasy VI, there were you didn't really have to deal with problems about getting from point A to point B in a decent amount of time, but the way that the world was made in Final Fantasy VII and a lot of subsequent JRPGs, especially Final Fantasies, there's so much world to travel through that while it is visibly beautiful, you're spending most of your time just going from point A to point B, interspersed with a couple of combats that make you forget that they're literally padding their time. So, do these things help or hinder the overall experience? Now, legacy. How does the new game build upon the brand? How does it make the name of the game something memorable? How does it promote its progenitor? When you have game 2, does it make you want to go and play game 1? Right? How much does it solidify things? Great example of this is every Legend of Zelda ever. Legend of Zelda has a legacy, a powerful one. When you pick up one Legend of Zelda and you play through it, you really want to pick up another Legend of Zelda and play through that because you'll know that these games are fairly similar in their form and you're likely to have fun with another one. Also, how does the new game prepare for the next one going forward for its sequel? This has a lot to do with mechanics and storytelling. So you have that. This is, of course, also a very serious problem that a lot of game developers run into as well. Because if you don't tell the story well for the continuation of that story, you run into what I like to call the fourth season Babylon 5 problem, which is you're assuming it's ending, you end the plot, and then you have to find some way to reopen it again. And that's never an easy thing to do. And finally, what core elements are being solidified so they repeat in the future games of the series? Again, to use Legend of Zelda, core element, the Master Sword. You will always find the Master Sword some way, shape, or form. You will always have some element of exploration, of going to a place and going to a dungeon and beating things with a sharpened stick. You will always have those elements because that is part of the legacy of every single game. Now, the next element is continuity. How does the story move from one game to the next? Now, this is heavily focused on story writing because there are games out there where when they go from game 1 to game 2, they don't make any sense. So this is what I like to call the nuclear hero problem. At the end of most games, your character has the power and really frequently has at that time to murder gods of darkness and destruction. And with that knowledge, you don't have a lot of luxury in saying, oh, they died mysteriously in their beds from an assassin in the night. When that kind of story trope happens, you have to wonder why the hero just didn't sneeze and then blow out the other side of their bedroom wall from the ensuing fireball, because them simply walking down the street would have run the risk of causing an earthquake. The progression has to make sense. A really good example of this failure of continuity would be from Chrono Trigger to Chrono Cross. Chrono Trigger had a very conclusive ending. Many of them actually, but all of them tend, not all, but tend to have the basic idea of the heroes beat the ever-living snot out of Lavos and then have some form of happily ever after. It does not make any sense at all that in Chrono Cross, the the pseudo main antagonist, I think his name was Lynx, somehow assassinated them. All of the original characters. How? You fight him in Chrono Cross. He is not particularly a difficult boss. How does this Catman defeat Chrono, Luca, and Marley? Answer? It doesn't make any sense. There's no continuity involving, and every time somebody says, "Oh, he snuck up on them at night," I am very hesitant to believe that the heroes that defeated Lavos are particularly heavy sleepers. But moving on, what happened to the heroes in the prior game? Do you tell that story, or is it left a mystery? What are the consequences? And this is very important. What are the consequences of the conclusion of the prior game? Because typically you're saving something big. Either you're saving the world, saving a nation, saving heaven or hell. You are saving something. What are the consequences of that long term? And finally, does the new story make any sense in relation to its prior game? This continuity element is essential for sequels. You have to make it make some kind of sense. Now, we're now moving into the elements of prequels, and prequels require all of the prior elements and more, because while it is in the context instead of going on to a later time period, we are talking about a prior time period, so bear that in mind. Some of these elements shift their meaning. So retcons are the biggest bane of prequels. Plain and simple. Changing elements of the story so your prequel makes sense is never a good thing, and it is a demonstration of a lack of creativity. So, how much does the prequel change the original? If elements of that are required to be completely thrown out the window in order for your new prequel to have that cool new character, then it's a sign of really bad writing, and it's usually a sign that the original writer isn't there anymore. So what is sacrificed to make the prequel possible? Because remember what I said early about removing the mystery. Prequels are very commonly all about stripping mystery away from the game and explaining elements of the past that the current game is founded on, right? Whenever you make a prequel, something doesn't make sense unless the prequel was pre-planned. And if it was pre-planned, everyone has to sit there and go, but why didn't you just make this the first game? And then the logic of the prequel breaks down. You almost never pre-plan a prequel. Try and say that 10 times fast. And again, does the story make sense? And if it doesn't make sense, why are you doing it? So now, once we've gotten over the elements of retcons, we have to talk about foundation. Prequels have to provide a foundation for the original game. They have to work together and ultimately make a series of games that have a smooth continuity. And does it make the original game fun to play again with the knowledge that you gain in its prequel? Is the setting enriched with the presence of this prequel? Because when you make a prequel of any stripe or variety, you will be coloring the elements of every game after it with what you have done. Now, I have Borderlands the pre-sequel as an excellent demonstration of a well-made prequel. Now, obviously, it is not a classic game, but it is definitely a good example of my point. Borderlands the pre-sequel, if it is played through, will change the tone of all the prior games because you actually learn the important elements of why certain characters are the way they are. And it changes your opinion, if you want to, of the characters of the very first Borderlands, which, given the nature of the Borderlands games, they're all very similar gameplay wise, it flows together very well as a series of 3 games. Now, the final element is progression. Does the game feel like it naturally comes before the original? Are there elements that exist in the prequel that don't exist in the original? What this means, and Metroid Zero Mission is a great example of this very important element. You can't have cool stuff in the prequel and not have it in the original game, because you're going to be sitting there going, why isn't this here? Why don't I have this really wonky, amazing, super cool power that existed in the prequel? Suddenly everybody got dumber across the universe. It makes no sense. So you have to be very careful about progression. You have to be very careful about the elements you put into it. And this is why I say prequels are much harder to make than sequels. And if I were a game developer, I would have a strict no prequel policy. I would tell the story starting with what I would assume the prequel was, and then move on from there. So, Metroid Zero Mission is the remake of the original Metroid. Now, is it technically a prequel? You could make the argument that it is, though it would be a prequel of probably Metroid 3, given the or Super Metroid, given the time that it came out. Obviously, later on we got a remake of Metroid 2, but the time that Metroid Zero Mission came out, it really was meant to come before Super Metroid, given the gameplay mechanics that it has been demonstrating. Because there are a lot of mechanics that are similar in Metroid Zero Mission, and it is actually far closer to Super Metroid. I keep on trying to say Metroid Prime. It is closer to Super Metroid than it is to say Metroid Fusion, which came out before Metroid Zero Mission, and it is trying to have you seamlessly flow into the still very beautiful and very very fun Super Metroid as a continuous series of games. Now, measuring the value of sequels and prequels is hard because a lot of sequels bomb and a lot of prequels bomb along the way. Now, sometimes a sequel can not have elements of innovation or legacy or even continuity. If done right, you don't need all three of these. You do need some of them to make it recognizable. There are great examples of, I would say, the Final Fantasy franchise, that while it is very good at innovation, and you can make the argument that it has a legacy, I would say, but it has pretty much no continuity. I wouldn't even really say that Final Fantasy has much of a legacy because the games have gone through so many changes. The only real legacy that's left, given that most Final Fantasies are either action games now or they are MMOs. They've gone so many different directions that there's not really anything that makes it definedly Final Fantasy beyond Squaresoft telling us it's Final Fantasy. And there's never any continuity with a few, like one or two exceptions. Ultimately, Final Fantasy, at least in my opinion, is a ruined franchise. There's nothing about Final Fantasy that you can point a finger at and say is Final Fantasy. You can look at older Final Fantasies and say, these were great games, but nothing about them is Final Fantasy. Nothing about them you can instantly identify as being core quintessential Final Fantasy. You can make the argument of, well, it's turn-based combat with a little, waiting timer. A lot of other games have that. That's not unique to Final Fantasy. Well, you can make the argument of a lot of the story elements like the summons. A lot of games have summon-like mechanics. It's not just Final Fantasy. So there are a couple of things that kind of are the vestigial structures of Final Fantasy that kind of run through all of them, but none of them actually matter that much to any of the plots. They're just kind of there. It's a bunch of memes wrapped together in a boy band game with no music generally. Well, that's not true. There are some Final Fantasies solely focused around being a boy or a girl band. But ultimately, if you have excellent innovation and good continuity, you can change ultimately the legacy. For a good example would be Mass Effect. Mass Effect 1 ultimately was, and I'm going to get so much hate for this, Mass Effect was actually Knights of the Old Republic 3. The gameplay mechanics were virtually the same. The movement and world exploration were virtually the same. And that legacy of Knights of the Old Republic had to be thrown away. And a new legacy had to be made, which was made in Mass Effect 2. Now, while you could make the argument that the story of Mass Effect 2 was not particularly good, the gameplay was vastly superior. And, a lot of other game reviewers are going to disagree with me that as well. When I'm going to have to be that guy that says, yeah, Mass Effect 2's gameplay was better than 1's. Yes, you lose a lot of role play elements, but Mass Effect was more fun without them, in my opinion. Continuity, we've already established that continuity is not necessarily essential, but there has to be something that makes the game the game. There usually, in any sequel, is some form of continuity, and that again is very dangerous because you have to explain what the hell happened to the prior characters. Generally speaking, the best games that have this continuity element generally say they just got old and died, which is the safest thing to do. You never want to go and say, the great hero who saved us from the dark and evil god that would crush the world in his bare hand, choked on a cucumber and died. I'm willing to believe that somebody that can, again, go up against the dark evil god, if he begins choking on a cucumber, he can probably push it, reach down his own throat and rip it out with a full metal gauntlet with the level of toughness that he has. Or just have his esophagus crush it, given the level of, ridiculous amounts of power he has. But ultimately, done poorly, these ruin franchises. And you want to see a list of game franchises that have been ruined by their sequels? Final Fantasy, Sonic the Hedgehog, oh God, Mass Effect, because Mass Effect 3 ruined the entire game. And should we really talk about Andromeda? We should talk about Andromeda. I, Obviously, there are games that have pottered along with uh, sequels that have been kind of mediocre, but a franchise truly ends when its sequels are crap. Now, prequels require so much planning to make sense. They require a level of creativity that most writers simply don't have. And without that level of creativity, we're talking about playing with dynamite. But sometimes you can do great things with dynamite. Other times you can basically blow up your house. So sequels and prequels are the generally speaking, sequels and prequels, especially prequels, are a get rich quick scheme combined with high risk, high reward. Now, again, good prequels can be amazing. They can do incredible things for the sake of the story. They usually just ruin it. So that's my basis and foundation of the concept of sequels and prequels. Thank you all so much for listening. I know it's a longer video, but I really like to talk and I really like to try and get my opinions about video gaming out there. So for those of you who made it to this point, thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you all again in the next video.